So Ruth chapter 1, verse 1 through verse 6, then verse 19 through verse 22. Let's read together. Once upon a time, it was back in the days when the judges led Israel. There was a famine in the land. A man from Bethlehem in Judah left his home to live in the country of Moab, he and his wife and his 2 sons. The man's name was Elimelech. His wife's name was Naomi. His sons were named Mahlon and Chilion, all Ephrathites from Bethlehem in Judah. They all went to the country of Moab and settled there. Elimelech died, and Naomi was left, she and her 2 sons. The sons took Moabite wives. The name of the first was Orpah, the second Ruth. They lived there in Moab for the next 10 years. But then the 2 brothers, Mahlon and Chilion, died. Now the woman was left without either her young men or her husband. She lost them all, lost her husband and lost her sons. Here's verse 6. One day she got herself together, she and her 2 daughters-in-law, to leave the country of Moab and set out for home. She had heard God had been pleased to visit his people and give them food. Drop down to verse, 19? Verse 19 through verse 22. And so the 2 of them traveled on together to Bethlehem. When they arrived in Bethlehem, the whole town was soon buzzing. Is this really our Naomi? And after all this time? But she said, don't call me Naomi. Call me bitter. The strong one has dealt me a bitter blow. I left here full of life, and God has brought me back with nothing but the clothes on my back. Why would you call me Naomi? God certainly doesn't. The strong one ruined me. And so Naomi was back, and Ruth the foreigner with her, back from the country of Moab. They arrived in Bethlehem at the beginning of barley harvest, the barley harvest. I want you to turn to your neighbor and shout to them, some things are hard to see. Got a neighbor on the other side, shout to them, some things are hard to see. You may be seated in the Lord's presence. That's what I want to talk about this morning. Some things are hard to see. By now, many of you remember Timmy, that precious little boy who was often a rambunctious child. He went to his dad and explained to his dad that for Christmas he wanted a PlayStation 3. His dad responded to him, Timmy, I don't think you've been a good enough child this year to deserve a PlayStation 3. He said, oh, yes, I have. Oh, yes, I have. And I want a PlayStation 3 for Christmas this year. His dad said to him, well, make your case directly to Jesus. And Timmy said, what do you mean? His dad said, well, I want you to write a letter to Jesus explaining to him why you feel you deserve a PlayStation 3 for Christmas. Timmy ran upstairs to his room, took out a piece of paper and a crayon and started writing. Dear Jesus, I've been a very good boy this year. Then he stopped because he recognized he was writing a letter to Jesus, and Jesus knows everything. So he balled that piece of paper up and started writing a second time. He wrote, Dear Jesus, I've been a pretty good boy this year. And then he remembered again. He was writing to Jesus, and Jesus knew everything. So he balled that piece of paper up. He took out a third piece and started to write, "Dear Jesus," and then he paused. A thought popped into his mind. He jumped up from his chair, put on his coat, put on his boots, put on his gloves, ran downstairs, ran out of the house, ran all the way to their church, where there was a nativity scene sitting in front of the church. He reached over to that nativity scene and grabbed the statue of the Virgin Mary. He ran all the way back home, ran all the way back up the stairs, ran all the way back to his room, took off his coat, took off his gloves and his boots, sat down and started writing another letter. This letter said, "Dear Jesus, this is Timmy. I've got your mama, and if you ever want to see her again, there had better be a PlayStation 3 underneath the tree on Christmas morning." On next Sunday here in our church and really across the globe, we will celebrate the birth of Jesus Christ. But I felt led that before we talk about him being born, that we would explain some of the painful events that led up to his birth in the first place. That takes us to this glorious book in the Bible, the book of Ruth. There's several main characters in this book, but God uses these characters and their circumstances to teach us things about God that we couldn't ordinarily learn. There's a man in the book of Ruth. His name is Elimelech. He is a very wealthy man. He is married to a woman named Naomi. They have two sons, Mahlon and Chilion. As they were in the region of Bethlehem, a famine broke out, and they needed to leave Bethlehem and go to a city called Moab because there was food to eat in Moab. No food in Bethlehem, but there was food in Moab. As they're making that journey and end up in this city, Elimelech, the husband of Naomi, dies. His two sons, Mahlon and Chilion, they marry wives in Moab. They are there for 10 years. Their families are developing and growing stronger. Now, as providence would have it, Naomi's sons met the same fate that her husband did, so that at some point, all three of them died. Naomi lost her husband and her two sons. She is left caring for her two daughters-in-law, Orpah and Ruth. Time brings it so that the famine that had existed in Bethlehem was lifted. And Naomi decided it was time for her to go back to her homeland, only to discover, Sister Deshauna, that her new daughters-in-law did not want her to leave them to the extent that they were willing to travel along with her. Naomi said to them, hold on now, hold on. She said, I've already lost my husband. I've already lost my two sons, which were your husbands. Don't come back to Bethlehem with me. Stay here amongst your own people. Here's why she told them to stay. She said, you all are still young enough to find a new husband to take care of you. Naomi said, I'm past the husband stage, but you all can find a husband to take care of you and to support you. She said, go back to your family and to your little g gods. Pay attention to that. That's going to mean something in a moment. Go back to your family. Go back to your little g gods. Orpah, even though she cried, decided to take Naomi's advice and stay in Moab. Ruth, however, announced to Naomi, wherever you're going, that's where I'm going. Whoever your people are, those will be my people. Wherever you lodge or wherever you live, that's where I'm going to live. And ultimately, wherever you lay down and die, that's where I'm going to die. And she refused to separate from her. And it is through that refusal to separate that the Lord reveals things to us from this passage that we couldn't find anywhere else in all of the sacred scriptures. So I want to walk through several of them. There are only 4 chapters in the book of Ruth, and these 4 chapters can really be divided into 4 separate and distinct categories. So if I was breaking this book into pieces, I would break it into 4 different pieces. The first piece is found here in chapter 1, verse 1 through verse 18, and it is there that you find the contributions of Naomi. The contributions of Naomi. She had to be a nice lady if her daughters-in-law loved her so much until even though their sons were gone, they still, even though their husbands were gone, they still wanted to be with their mother-in-law. She was an in-law, not an outlaw. She was a mother-in-law, not a monster-in-law. She had made some contributions. That means that she had treated her husband well. She had treated her sons well. She had treated their wives well, so much so until they wanted to continue to live with her even after the sons and the husbands were gone. You find the contributions of Naomi. But that's not all you find. The Bible also records the absolute collapse of Naomi. The absolute collapse of Naomi. Even though she had made a lot of contributions, she also suffered a collapse. I was listening to one of my colleagues preach this week, and one of the things that he pointed out is that most pastors of churches die on Mondays. He reported that 74% of all pastors who die on Mondays. And they die because of either what they saw on Sunday or what they didn't see. And the depression and lack of fulfillment causes them to succumb to anxiety, and they die on Monday. Here's what I'm getting at. It doesn't matter how many contributions you make, you can still have an absolute collapse. And Naomi, according to chapter 1, verse 19 through verse 22, Naomi had an absolute collapse. Look at what you find in verse 19 through verse 22. The Bible says, and so the two, remember Orpah decided to stay in Moab, but Ruth and Naomi came back together. And so the two of them traveled on together to Bethlehem. When they arrived in Bethlehem, the whole town was soon buzzing. Is this really our Naomi after all this time? And watch her collapse. But she said, don't call me Naomi. Call me bitter. You read this in some other translations. Her name Naomi means pleasant. And she said, don't call me Naomi, call me Mara, which means bitter. Now, a crowd has gathered. They ain't seen her in over 10 years. They are excited to see Naomi coming home. And I'm sure some of them were wondering, where's Elimelech, her wealthy husband? Where's Mahlon? Where's Chilion? Interestingly, Mahlon's name meant weak, and Chilion's name meant sickly. Be careful what you name your kids. He said, is this really Naomi after all this time? But she says in verse 20, don't call me Naomi, call me bitter. Now, who is she upset with? The strong one, capital S, capital O. The strong one has dealt me a bitter blow. I left here full of life, and God has brought me back with nothing but the clothes on my back. Why would you call me Naomi? God certainly doesn't. The strong one ruined me. And so Naomi was back, and Ruth the foreigner with her, back from the country of Moab. They arrived in Bethlehem at the beginning of the barley harvest. The absolute collapse of Naomi. We see her contributions in chapter 1. We see her collapse in chapter 1. I want to breathe a word about the correction of Naomi because it occurs in chapter 2. The correction of Naomi. When you get to the early verses of chapter 2, Naomi's daughter-in-law, Ruth, say, you know what? We got to eat, and right now we are void of employment. She says, so there is a practice called gleaning, and poor people in a community would be allowed to go into the fields of others where they were harvesting barley or grain or wheat, and the poor would be allowed to glean in the field. Here's how gleaning worked. As the workers were baling up the barley and putting it on a wagon, anything that fell to the ground could not be picked up by the workers. It had to be left behind for the gleaners so that the gleaners could go and gather that which had fallen. So Ruth said, remember Ruth is the daughter-in-law, I want to go gleaning in order to help take care of our family. And by the time you get to chapter 2, she starts gleaning, but she did not know whose field she was gleaning in. She learned later that the field she was gleaning in actually belonged to one of the relatives of her dead father-in-law. And boy, did he hook her up. He goes as far as to say to the servants, let her pick up whatever she wants to pick up. Matter of fact, throw some stuff down on purpose. It's right there in Ruth chapter 2. The servants were instructed not to touch her, and anything she wanted, she could have. Now, when you read Ruth chapter 2, another thing you'll discover about Ruth is the Bible says she worked all morning long until the mandatory evening break, but didn't stop to take a 15-minute break in between. She was a hard-working girl. Is that a word? Girl. She was a hard-working girl. Hey, and watch how God corrects Naomi, because Naomi's conclusion was, I have lost everything. Watch how God shows her correction and begins to turn things around. You see it in chapter 2 and in verse 20. Watch that verse. This is after Ruth comes home and tells her that she has met a man, and the man told her he was a relative of her dead father-in-law, and that whatever she wanted in the field, she could have it. Watch Naomi's response when she hears this. Naomi said, this is in chapter 2, verse 20, Naomi said to her daughter-in-law, why God has blessed that man. God hasn't quite walked out on us after all. He still loves us in bad times as well as good. Naomi went on, that man, Ruth, is one of our circle of covenant redeemers, a close relative of ours. That's Naomi's correction. Hey, saint, deep child of God, Bible-toting, fire-walking, tongue-talking, van-driving believer. You can collapse, but thank God he will correct you. And I contend that all of us in this room fall in one of these three different categories. Somebody is in our contribution phase. You keep giving, working as hard as you can to help everybody who is around you. But a day is coming with your giving self when it is going to appear that all of your labor is in vain. And if you're not careful, you'll move from the contribution stage to the stage of absolute collapse, where you wonder if it's all in vain. When the children whose teeth you put braces on start sucking their teeth because of something you asked them to do, it makes you wonder if it's all in vain. When the husband or wife that you helped to buy the car rolls their eyes because one day you bring it home without a full tank of gas, you begin to wonder if your labor is all in vain. But thank God that he has a way of correcting us. And Naomi's conclusion was, God is not through with us yet. Well, this chapter breaks down into four pieces: the contributions of Naomi, the absolute collapse of Naomi, the correction of Naomi. But then I want to push even a step further: the conquering of Naomi. When you read chapters 3 and chapter 4, you discover that we serve a conquering God. And he not only wants us to conquer, he wants us to be more than conquerors. He not only wants you to succeed, he wants you to have success on top of success. He not only wants to bring you out, he wants to bring you out having more than what you had when you went in. So by the time you get to chapter 3, it is after chapter 1 and chapter 2. You say, Pastor, we can read. We know our numbers. In chapter 1, Naomi thinks she has lost everything. In chapter 2, there is a glimmer of hope because her daughter-in-law has now met a man who was related to her husband, and the man is taking care of them by providing food on a daily basis. But when you get to chapter 3, Naomi says to her daughter-in-law, Ruth, she said, you know what? You's a young girl. I'm going to countryrize this text. You's a young girl. Time for you to get a husband. And the husband you ought to get is the near kinsman to your dead father-in-law, whose name was Elimelech. But his near kinsman's name is Boaz. And I think you and Boaz would make a power couple. So by the time you read chapter 3, Naomi and Ruth begin the process of letting Boaz know that Ruth is suitable and available for marriage. And by the time you get to chapter 4, it is on and popping. And Boaz marries Ruth. They become one big happy family, and God uses them to turn the world upside down. When you read Matthew's Gospel, chapter 1, and verse 17, you find what is called the lineage or the family history of Jesus Christ. You learn about the generations that occurred. Beginning in verse, we're not going to turn there, but beginning in verse 1 of Matthew chapter 1, person after person, all the way from the beginning of the creation, you begin to see all of the generations that led to the birth of Jesus Christ. When you get to verse 17 of Matthew chapter 1, it tells us that those generations were broken down into 3 different groups. The first group was the first 14 generations. It covered those from Abraham all the way to David. The second set of 14 covered those from David all the way to the Babylonian captivity. And then the last set of 14 goes from the Babylonian captivity all the way to the birth of Jesus. We'll see that by the time we get to the end of chapter 4, that were there no Ruth, there could have been no, or were there no Naomi, there could have been no Ruth. Were there no Ruth, there could have been no Boaz. Were there no Boaz, there could have been no David. And were there no David, there would have been no Jesus. Pastor, if God was going to do all of this for Naomi, by the time we get to chapters 3 and 4, why did Naomi have a collapse in chapter 1? So glad you asked. If God was going to do all of this for her in chapter 3 and 4, turn her life upside down, bless her in ways she had never imagined, why did she have a collapse in chapter 1? I'll tell you why. Because some things are hard to see. And somebody in here today, the clouds appear to be so low. The darkness appears to be so thick. The pain appears to be so great. And you have concluded that it's not going to get any better than what it is. On the authority of the Word of God, things are going to get better. Might be hard for you to see, but things are going to get better. Let me give it to you another way. Your storm won't last always. Let me give it to you another way. Better days are coming. Let me give it to you another way. I don't feel no ways tired. I come too far from where I started from. Nobody told me the road would be easy, but I don't believe he brought me this far to leave me. What then are the lessons we learn in this collection of chapters that we can take with us today, tomorrow, this week, this month, then this year, all the way from our place of collapse, all the way to our place of conquering? I'm so glad you asked. Just 3 things I want to drop with you as if you were gleaning in my fields. There are 3 things I want to drop on purpose. Here is the first one. Recognize this. Everybody needs somebody sometime. I love in chapter 2, verse 1 through verse 7, the attitude of Ruth. It says in chapter 2, verse 1, it so happened that Naomi had a relative by marriage, a man prominent and rich, connected with Elimelech's family. His name was Boaz. One day Ruth, the Moabite foreigner, said to Naomi, I'm going to work. I'm going out to glean among the sheaves, following after some harvester who will treat me kindly. Naomi said, go ahead, dear daughter. All right, here's how this conversation would have went with some of us. I'm going down to the labor office to apply for a day's work. And some of us would have said, don't you go down there. Our family has never gone to labor force. I'm going down to the housing authority to see if I can get us some affordable house. Don't you go down there standing in that line. Our people don't stand in lines. And you hungry? Going down there to the child support office. Going down there to the food stamp office. Our people don't do those kinds of things. Newsflash, everybody needs somebody sometime. What are you getting at, Pastor Thorpe? Never allow your pride to keep you from asking for help. Don't get mad at me. Don't get mad at me. Don't get mad at me if the Lord pulls your card soon. Because somebody right here in this room said, he sure ain't talking to me this morning. I ain't asking nobody for nothing. If I got to ask for it, I'll do without. Don't get mad at me if God pulls your card and puts you in a position that you got to reach out for somebody to do something for you. Settle it in your mind that everybody needs somebody sometime. It's proven here in the language of the text. By the time you get to verse 7, she said, at the end of verse 2, she says, I want to go to somebody who's going to treat me kindly. Here's verse 3. And so she set out. She went and started gleaning in a field, following in the wake of the harvesters. That means the rows that the harvesters were leaving. She was following along behind them, picking up whatever they dropped. Eventually, she ended up in the part of the field owned by Boaz, her father-in-law Elimelech's relative. A little later, Boaz came out from Bethlehem greeting his harvesters. God be with you, he said. Here's how they replied, and God bless you. Boaz asked his young servants, who was foreman over the farm hands? He asked them, who is this young woman? Where does she come from? The foreman said, why, that's the Moabite girl, the one who came with Naomi from the country of Moab. She asked permission, let me glean, she said, and gather among the sheaves following after your harvesters. She's been at it steady ever since, from early morning until now, without so much as a break. That's why some of us wouldn't have gotten noticed. We'd have been checking in on Facebook, making stories on Instagram. You out there in the field, you're supposed to be picking up grain and barley. You on Snapchat with bunny ears and a bunny nose. She hadn't even taken a break. Working so hard, she hadn't even taken a break. Everybody needs somebody sometime. Never allow your pride to keep you from asking for help. Well, here's the second conclusion I want to draw. Not only do I want to tell you that everybody needs somebody sometime, I want to say this because it's in the text. God sees you, and he has people watching you. Okay, have deep saints. Remember, when you break this book into 4 pieces, the first piece you see are the contributions of Naomi. She was a hard-working woman who loved her husband, loved her sons, loved her daughters-in-law. She put her time in. But then life happened to her. Because it didn't matter how hard she worked, trouble kept showing up at her address. Her first heartbreak, no doubt, was the great famine that pushed them from Bethlehem all the way to Moab. And then her husband died. And while she's trying to deal with the grief of her husband, a part of her consolation was, well, at least I still got my 2 boys. Because in their day, if you lost a husband, it was the responsibility of sons, if they were old enough, to pick up where the dad had left off. At least I still got my sons. And a day came when the sons died too. They had to leave Moab, go back to Bethlehem, because the famine that had been there was now lifted. And as she comes in, the people of the city, okay, all right. Anybody else in here like me? That sometimes when I'm going through a rough period, I try to convince myself that it's not as rough as I thought it was, but then something makes me click. Y'all should see me. It's a blessing before God that there ain't cameras mounted all around this church, because y'all would think I was crazy. Because sometimes I be around here working, trying to make things work a certain way, and I'm telling myself the whole time, God is good, Pastor Thorpe. God is good. He woke you up this morning. There's a leak in the roof, but God is good, Pastor Thorpe. And I'm talking to myself the whole time, and then I see something, some small minor thing, and it makes me click. Then I have to come back to myself. Okay, I'm looking for some saints who try to go to your job with a good attitude. You try to speak to everybody. You try to smile. Now, you got all kind of issues going on in your mind, but you're trying to hold it all together and look like you all holy and saved and Jesus-filled. Then somebody starts pushing your buttons. You say, all right now. All right now. You don't know how close I am to the edge. And then somebody can come along and just say something innocent. You trying to make yourself feel better. Some of y'all do this. You trying to make yourself feel better when you're having a rough day. You trying to take something out your closet that's new that you hadn't ever worn before, just to make you feel a little bit better. So your whole day was all down, but you say, at least my shoes are the bomb.com. And all of a sudden somebody says to you, where you get them shoes from? And you just lose it. See, these shoes ain't none of your business. What you need to do what you need to do is get them papers out there, copy machine. That's what they pay you for, not to look at my shoes. And you click. Naomi came back home. A crowd had gathered to welcome her because they heard she was on the way. And they said, is not this Naomi? She said, don't even call me Naomi. Naomi means pleasant. She said, call me Mara, because I'm bitter. She said, I came out of this place full, but I'm coming back empty with only the clothes that are on my back. Everybody needs somebody sometime. Why? Because as bad as it may seem, God sees you and he has people watching you. You don't believe it, do you? You say, Pastor, I don't believe it. You should believe it. God sees you and he has people watching you. It's in verse 8 through verse 13 of chapter 2. Look at verse 8. Then Boaz spoke to Ruth, listen, my daughter, from now on, don't go to any other field to glean. Stay right here in this one and stay close to my young women. Watch where they are harvesting and follow them. And don't worry about a thing. Don't you worry about a thing. All right, let's just head and get that whole thing in there. I've given orders to my servants not to harass you. When you get thirsty, feel free to go and drink from the water buckets that the servants have filled. She dropped to her knees, then bowed her face to the ground. How does this happen that you should pick me out and treat me so kindly, a foreigner? Boaz answered her, I've heard all about you. Heard about the way you treated your mother-in-law after the death of her husband, and how you left your father and mother and the land of your birth and have come to live among a bunch of total strangers. God reward you well for what you've done, and with a generous bonus besides from God, to whom you've come seeking protection under his wings. She said, oh, sir, such grace, such kindness, I don't deserve it. You've touched my heart, treated me like one of your own, and I don't even belong here. God sees you, and he's got people watching you. Because one of the primary ways that the Lord blesses us is through other people. God sees you, but he's got some people watching you. We thought, what are they watching me for? I'm glad you asked. 2 reasons. Here's the first one. To provide for you. To provide for you. In verse 14 through verse 18, that's what Boaz is doing. He is seeing to it that she is provided for. Look at verse 14. At the lunch break, Boaz said to her, come over here. Come on over here. Let me holler at you, shouty. Come over here. Eat some bread. Now, what she's collecting in the field are the ingredients for bread. Boaz say, come on over here with me and eat some of the finished product. Eat bread. Dip it in the wine. So she joined the harvesters. Boaz passed the roasted grain to her. She ate her fill and even had some left over. When she got up to go back to work, Boaz ordered his servants, and watch this is heavy. He ordered his servants, let her glean where there's still plenty of grain on the ground. Make it easy for her. Better yet, pull some of the good stuff out and leave it for her to glean. Give her special treatment. Ruth gleaned in the field until evening. When she threshed out what she had gathered, she ended up with nearly a full sack of barley. She gathered up her gleanings, went back to town, and showed her mother-in-law the results of her day's work. She also gave her the leftovers from her lunch. You know you blessed when you can bless some other people right along with you. God's got some people watching you to provide for you, but not only to provide for you, to protect you. It is not by accident that in chapter 2 and verse 9, Boaz gave strict instructions that none of the servants were to harass Ruth. By the time you get to verse 21 through verse 23, there's a pretty strong word in verse 21 through verse 23, but I'm going to trust that you're big enough to handle it. Watch verse 21. Ruth the Moabitess said, well, listen to this. He also told me, she's telling her mother-in-law Naomi what Boaz told her. Listen to this. He also told me, stick with my workers until my harvesting is finished. Naomi said to Ruth, that's wonderful, dear daughter. Do that. You'll be safe in the company of his young women. No danger now of being raped in some stranger's field. So Ruth did it, stuck close to Boaz's young women, gleaning in the fields daily until both the barley and wheat harvesting were finished, and she continued living with her mother-in-law. God will put people around you to provide for you and to protect you. And it could be that some of the people, don't none of y'all in here cuss, but some of the people, your cousins, are cussing out. Maybe the very person that God sent to provide for you and to protect you. Parents, be careful how you treat your children. You don't know which one of them you're going to need. Help me, somebody. Everybody needs somebody sometimes. God sees you and he has people watching you. Here's the last thing and I'm out. Never be afraid of the process. And I'm not talking about a perm. Never be afraid of the process. Come on, you know what this is. You know what this is. That's somebody who's afraid. Afraid of the process. Never be afraid of the process. By the time you get to chapter 3, Naomi says, you know what, this is too good for us to miss. Naomi says, maybe the reason that God has orchestrated all of this is so that Boaz can be your husband. So in chapter 3, Naomi gives her daughter-in-law some instructions, some wise instructions. She said, what I want you to do is, she said, I want you to go back to Boaz's house because it's at the end of harvesting, there's going to be a party. That means that Boaz is going to eat good and he's going to drink good. And she says, wait until he is feeling it. Wait until he's in the spirit from the spirits. And what you want to do is, once he falls asleep, find where he's sleeping, uncover his feet, and lie down at the foot of his bed. It was a custom in their day that signified they were available for marriage. And Boaz woke up. There's something on my feet. And he woke up. It's in the dark. He said, who that down there? You know what she said? Ruth. She said, I just want you to know that I'm available for marriage and that you are a kinsman redeemer for our family. And I think it'd be a good idea if the two of us became the one of us. Boaz said, you know what? That's a perfect idea. He said, when tomorrow comes, I'm going to work on this with all that I have. But watch this. Watch what he tells her. He says, I am your kinsman redeemer, but there's another kinsman in the family line who's closer to you than I am. What he was saying was, according to tradition, there is another relative who by law can take on the property of your father-in-law and take you on as his wife. And what Boaz agreed to do was to go through the process and do things the right way. Boaz says, I ain't got to cheat. I don't have to connive. I don't have to rob. I don't have to steal. And the problem with a whole lot of us is we want the promise, we just don't want the process. We want to walk in all the benefits. We so funny. We so funny. We so funny. One of your friends will call you and say, oh, they're hiring on my job. And you say, good, I'll be down there in 30 minutes. They say, wait a minute, you still got to fill out an application. Still got to do a background check. Still got to take a drug test. Well, I didn't know I had to go through all that. Do you want the job or don't you want the job? Because sometimes we get discouraged by the process. Imagine this. Young Ruth hearing her mother-in-law Naomi say, go tell Boaz you are available to be his wife. In Ruth's mind, that was the end of the discussion. All I got to do is tell him and wedding bells will be ringing. Only to discover that there was a process. She didn't see the process coming. And some of us, God has opened doors of opportunity for us, but we didn't recognize there was going to be a process on the other side of the door. And some of us been trying to close the door because we are afraid of the process. When the truth is, you can't get to it if you ain't willing to go through it. It's a process. It's a process. So watch chapter 4, verse 1 through verse 10. Ruth chapter 4, verse 1 through verse 10. Boaz went straight to the public square. He was a G. Straight up gangster. Boaz went straight to the public square, took his place there. Before long, the closer relative, the one mentioned earlier by Boaz, strolled by. He's so smooth, Doc Jones. He's so smooth. Watch what Boaz said. He said, stop aside, old friend, said Boaz. Take a seat. The man sat down. Boaz then gathered 10 of the town elders together and said, sit down here with us. We've got some business to take care of. And he sat down. Boaz then said to his relative, the piece of property that belonged to our relative Elimelech is being sold by his widow Naomi, who was just returned from the country of Moab. I thought you ought to know about it. Buy it back if you want it. You can make it official in the presence of those sitting here and before the town elders. You have first redeemer rights. Now, if you don't want it, tell me so I'll know where I stand. You're first in line to do this, and I'm next after you. Watch his response. He said, I'll buy it. Then Boaz added, you realize, don't you, that when you buy the field from Naomi, you also get Ruth the Moabite, the widow of our dead relative, along with the redeemer responsibility to have children with her to carry on the family inheritance. Then the relative said, oh, I can't do that. He said, I jeopardize my own family inheritance. You go ahead and buy it. You can have my rights. I can't do it. In the olden times in Israel, this is how they handled official business regarding matters of property and inheritance. A man would take off his shoe and give it to the other person. This is the same as an official seal or personal signature in Israel. So Boaz's redeemer relative said, go ahead, buy it. He signed the deal by pulling off his shoe. He got a shoe on it. Don't be afraid of the process. Because first thing Boaz says is, I'm not going to cheat, because when you cheat, that'll come back to haunt you. We're almost in tax season. 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 Don't be claiming kids you haven't taken care of. It's going to come back and get you one day. You going to claim your kids? Well, if you're not going to claim all of them, let me claim 2 or 3 of them. You didn't take care of them kids. And then come in here and sing about what a mighty God we serve. And you cheating the IRS? Look at what happens when you do right by God. Drop to verse 14 through verse 17 of chapter 4, and I'm done. Here's verse 14. This is after everything is settled. Ruth becomes the wife of Boaz. Here's verse 14. The town women said to Naomi, "Blessed be God. He didn't leave you without family to carry on your life. May this baby grow up to be famous in Israel. He'll make you young again. He'll take care of you in old age. And this daughter-in-law who has brought him into the world and loves you so much, why, she's worth more to you than 7 sons." Naomi took the baby and held him in her arms, cuddling him, cooing over him, waiting on him hand and foot. The neighborhood women started calling him Naomi's baby boy. But the real name was Obed. And Obed was the father of Jesse. And Jesse, the father of David. Had there been no Naomi, there would have been no Ruth. Had there been no Ruth, there would have been no Boaz. Had there been no Boaz, there would have been no Obed, no Jesse, no David, no Jesse, no Jesus. Some things are hard to see. All she saw was, my husband has died. My sons have died in the midst of famine, and God has abandoned me. She said, matter of fact, change my name. I am no longer pleasant, I am bitter. But God knew that he was up to something. And if you can survive your collapse, he'll bring you some correction and he'll make you conquer. And I don't know what stage you're in right now. Some of us are still in the contribution stage. You're giving. Some of us in here not in the contribution stage. You're in the mad stage. You are having an absolute collapse. Only reason you came to church is so you didn't kill the people you left at home. An absolute collapse. You want to know if church is going to be open tomorrow to give you somewhere else to go other than to your job. Because there's some folks there you done put on a list. Because some things are really hard to see. Really hard to see. But if you keep your hand in God's hand, he will lead you. He will guide you. Because he sees you. He sees you. He knows what you're going through. And help is on the way. Did you hear what I said? He sees you and help is on the way. Stand with me, please.